Silas Knox had been riding with killers long enough to know when they were getting ready to kill him too. That's why he dug 6 shallow graves behind the canyon rocks before he went to sleep. Silas Knox wasn't like the others. He rode with the Rattlesnake Gang, the meanest bunch of outlaws in the whole Arizona territory. They robbed banks, rustled cattle, and generally made life miserable for anyone who crossed their path. But Silas, he had a quietness about him, a way of watching and listening that the others didn't possess. He could spot a hawk circling miles away or hear the faint rustle of a snake in the grass. And lately he'd been noticing things about his own gang that made his skin crawl. It started small, a quick glance from Snake Eye Johnson that lingered a little too long, a twitch of Rooster Joe's hand near the handle of his six-shooter, whispers that stopped abruptly when he walked into camp. At first he tried to ignore it, maybe he was just being jumpy. Life in the Arizona territory was enough to make anyone nervous, but the feeling wouldn't go away. It gnawed at him like a hungry coyote. He'd seen it before, back when he rode with the Blackwater boys. The same looks, the same whispers. It always ended the same way, a bullet in the back and a shallow grave. They were going to kill him. They wanted his share of the loot from the last bank job in Tombstone. Silas had a knack for planning those heists, and his cut was considerable, enough to make a greedy man do terrible things. He wasn't sure when they'd make their move, but he knew it was coming. He could feel it in the air, thick and heavy like a brewing thunderstorm. He had to be ready. He couldn't trust any of them, not even Rooster Joe, who he'd shared a bottle of whiskey with just last week. In this life, trust was a luxury you couldn't afford, especially when dealing with men like the Rattlesnake Gang. Silas knew he had to act fast before they had the chance to put a bullet in him. He had to turn the tables on them and show them that Silas Knox was not a man to be trifled with. His time with the Rattlesnake Gang was coming to a bloody end. The signs were small, almost invisible to the untrained eye. But Silas wasn't untrained. He'd learned to read men like others read books, flipping through the pages of their faces, searching for the truth hidden beneath the surface. Snake Eye Johnson, usually so eager to share a joke, now avoided Silas's gaze. His one good eye darted nervously around the campfire, never settling for long. It was like watching a trapped bird, desperate to escape. Rooster Joe, the gang's loudmouth, had gone strangely silent. He used to brag about every robbery, every gunfight, every close call. Now he just sat hunched over his tin cup, staring into the swirling coffee like he was searching for answers at the bottom. And when Silas spoke to him, Joe would just grunt a reply, his eyes never meeting Silas's. Then there was Billy the Kid, Carson, the youngest of the bunch. He usually idolized Silas, hanging on his every word, eager to learn from the older outlaw. But lately, Billy had been acting distant, almost afraid. He'd flinch whenever Silas came near, and his face would turn pale. Silas had even caught him whispering with Snake Eye and Rooster Joe behind a stack of crates, their heads closed together like vultures circling a dying animal. It wasn't just their behavior. It was the little things, too. The way they suddenly stopped sharing their whiskey. The way they positioned themselves around the campfire, always keeping Silas in their line of sight. The way they cleaned their guns over and over, even though they'd just been cleaned the day before. One evening, Silas was sharpening his Bowie knife when he noticed Snake Eye staring at him. Not a casual glance, but a long, lingering look filled with something that sent a shiver down Silas's spine. It was a look that said, "Your time is coming." That was the moment Silas knew for sure. They were planning to kill him. He finished sharpening his knife, the steel gleaming in the firelight. He slowly ran his thumb along the blade, testing its sharpness. He looked up at Snake Eye, his own eyes cold and hard. He didn't say a word, but his message was clear. "I know what you're planning, and I'm ready for you." The game had changed. It was no longer a question of if but when, and Silas intended to be the one who decided. The desert moon hung like a silver coin in the inky sky, casting long, eerie shadows across the desolate landscape. It was a night for secrets, for whispers carried on the wind, for deeds done under the cloak of darkness. Silas waited until the camp was quiet, until the only sounds were the crackling of the dying fire and the distant howl of a coyote. Then he rose silently and slipped into the shadows. He grabbed a shovel from the back of a wagon and walked a short distance from the camp towards a patch of rocky ground. He knew what he had to do, and he wouldn't let fear or doubt cloud his mind. He had to convince the Rattlesnake Gang that they had the upper hand, that their plan was foolproof. He had to lull them into a false sense of security. He started digging. The ground was hard and unforgiving, but Silas worked with a grim determination. Each scoop of dirt was a step closer to survival. He dug 6 shallow graves just deep enough to look convincing in the moonlight. He spaced them out evenly as if they were meant for 6 bodies, which in a way they were. As he dug, he thought about the men he'd ridden with for so long. He thought about the robberies they'd pulled off, the close calls they'd survived, the bonds they'd forged in the heat of battle. He wondered how it had all come to this. How had greed and betrayal poisoned their brotherhood? When he was finished, he stood back and surveyed his work. The 6 shallow graves looked ominous in the moonlight, a stark reminder of the violence that was about to unfold. He knew that the Rattlesnake Gang would see them. They were meant to be seen. He carefully scattered some loose dirt around the edges of the graves, making them look as if they'd been dug hastily in a hurry. He even tossed in a few rocks and weeds to add to the illusion. He wanted them to believe that he was scared, desperate, and unprepared. Then he walked back to camp, his face expressionless. He laid down on his bedroll, pulled his hat over his eyes, and waited. He knew they would come. It was just a matter of time, and when they did, he would be ready. The graves were dug, the stage was set, and the final act was about to begin. Silas closed his eyes, listening to the whispers of the desert wind, and waited for the storm to break. Lying on his bedroll, Silas wasn't really sleeping. Every nerve in his body was stretched tight, listening, waiting. The desert night was full of sounds, the chirping of crickets, the rustling of small animals in the brush, the distant hoot of an owl. But Silas was listening for something else, the soft pad of footsteps, the creak of leather, the hushed whispers of men plotting his demise. He knew they would be watching him. He had made sure of that. The graves were a message, a carefully crafted illusion designed to play on their greed and arrogance. He wanted them to believe that he was digging his own grave, that he was surrendering without a fight. He pictured them huddled together in the shadows, their eyes gleaming with anticipation, their hands itching to pull the triggers of their guns. He imagined Snake-Eye Johnson grinning, Rooster Joe nodding in agreement, and Billy the Kid, Carson, looking pale and conflicted. Silas knew that Billy was the weak link. He was young and impressionable, and Silas suspected that he had been coerced into the plot. Maybe, just maybe, there was a chance to save him. But right now, survival was his priority. He reached under his bedroll and gripped the handle of his Colt Peacemaker. It was cold and heavy in his hand, a familiar comfort in this deadly game. He checked the cylinder, making sure it was fully loaded. He had 6 bullets, 6 chances to survive. He closed his eyes, trying to slow his breathing to calm his racing heart. He needed to be focused, alert, and ready to react in an instant. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. One wrong move, one moment of hesitation, and he would be dead. The minutes stretched into an eternity. The moon climbed higher in the sky, bathing the desert in its pale, ethereal light. The wind picked up, swirling dust and sand around the camp. Silas could feel the tension building, like a coiled spring about to snap. He knew they were close. He could feel their presence, their malevolent intent, like a dark cloud hanging over him. He took a deep breath and waited. The night was about to explode. A twig snapped. Silas's eyes snapped open. He didn't move, didn't make a sound. He just lay there, perfectly still, listening. There it was again, a faint rustling in the brush, closer this time. They were coming. He could hear their whispered voices, barely audible above the wind. He couldn't make out the words, but he didn't need to. He knew what they were saying. Get ready. Remember the plan. No mistakes. He felt a surge of adrenaline coursing through his veins, sharpening his senses, preparing him for the fight. He took a slow, deep breath, focusing on the task at hand, survival. He wasn't going to die in this god-forsaken desert, not tonight. The shadows began to move, to coalesce into dark, menacing shapes. He could see them now, creeping towards him, their guns drawn, their faces grim. Snake-Eye Johnson was in the light, his one good eye gleaming with a predatory hunger. Rooster Joe was right behind him, his hand steady on his pistol. And Billy the Kid, Carson, brought up the rear, his face pale and drawn, his eyes filled with fear. They were almost upon him now, just a few feet away. Silas could feel their hot breath on his face, could smell the gun oil and sweat. He knew that this was it, the moment of truth. He waited until they were close enough to touch, until he could see the whites of their eyes. Then he exploded into action. He rolled off his bedroll, drawing his Colt Peacemaker in one swift motion. He fired 2 shots in rapid succession, aiming for Snake-Eye Johnson and Rooster Joe. The shots rang out in the still night air, shattering the silence, announcing the beginning of the end. Snake-Eye Johnson staggered backward, clutching his chest, a look of surprise on his face. Rooster Joe screamed and dropped to the ground, clutching his leg. The ambush had begun, but Silas Knox was ready. He was armed, he was dangerous, and he was fighting for his life. The Rattlesnake Gang had made a terrible mistake. They had underestimated Silas Knox, and now they were about to pay the price. The desert was about to become a graveyard. The night erupted in a cacophony of gunfire, shouts, and screams. Bullets whizzed through the air, kicking up dust and sand. Silas dove behind a nearby wagon, using it as cover. He reloaded his Colt Peacemaker, his movements swift and practiced. Billy the Kid Carson stood frozen in place, his gun still holstered, his face a mask of terror. Silas yelled at him, "Billy, get down, get out of the way." But Billy didn't move. He just stood there, caught between his loyalty to the gang and his fear of Silas. He was a deer caught in the headlights, unable to make a decision. Silas knew he couldn't waste any time worrying about Billy. He had to focus on surviving. He peeked out from behind the wagon and fired another shot, hitting Rooster Joe in the shoulder. Joe screamed again and rolled over, clutching his arm. Snake Eye Johnson, despite his chest wound, was still a threat. He had managed to draw his gun and was firing wildly in Silas's direction. Silas ducked back behind the wagon as bullets ricocheted off the metal. He knew he couldn't stay behind the wagon forever. He had to move to change his position to keep them guessing. He took a deep breath and sprang out from behind the wagon, firing as he moved. He aimed for Snake Eye Johnson, squeezing the trigger with deadly precision. The bullet hit Johnson square in the forehead and he crumpled to the ground, dead before he hit the sand. With Snake Eye down, Silas turned his attention to Rooster Joe. Joe was still lying on the ground, wounded and helpless. Silas walked over to him, his gun pointed at Joe's head. "Please, Silas," Joe begged, "don't kill me. I didn't want to do it. They made me." Silas looked down at Joe, his face hard and unforgiving. He knew that Joe was lying. He had been just as eager to kill Silas as Snake Eye had been, but Silas wasn't a cold-blooded killer. He didn't enjoy taking lives. He lowered his gun. "Get out of here, Joe," he said. "Get out of the territory and never come back. If I ever see you again, I'll kill you." Joe didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled to his feet and limped away into the darkness, disappearing into the desert night. Silas turned to Billy the Kid Carson, who was still standing there, frozen in place. "Billy," Silas said, his voice softer now, "it's over. They're gone. You don't have to be afraid anymore." Billy looked at Silas, his eyes filled with tears. "I didn't want to do it, Silas," he said. "They made me, I swear." Silas believed him. He could see the truth in Billy's eyes. He reached out and put a hand on Billy's shoulder. "I know, Billy," he said. "I know." The gunfight was over. The desert was silent again except for the soft whisper of the wind. Silas Knox had survived, but he knew that his life would never be the same. He had crossed a line and there was no going back. He was alone now, an outlaw with a price on his head, and he had a secret to uncover. The first rays of dawn painted the desert sky in hues of orange and pink, a stark contrast to the darkness and violence of the night. Silas stood amidst the carnage, his face grim, his body aching. He surveyed the scene, taking in the full extent of the damage. Snake Eye Johnson lay sprawled in the sand, his sightless eyes staring up at the sky. Rooster Joe had vanished into the darkness, leaving behind a trail of blood. Billy the Kid Carson sat huddled near the campfire, his face buried in his hands, sobbing softly. Silas walked over to Billy and knelt beside him. "It's over, Billy," he said gently. "You're safe now." Billy looked up at Silas, his eyes red and swollen. "What am I going to do, Silas?" he asked. "I have nowhere to go." "You can come with me," Silas said. "We'll figure something out." Billy hesitated. "But you're an outlaw," he said. "I don't want to be an outlaw." "You don't have to be," Silas said. "You can make your own choices now. You can be whatever you want to be." Silas helped Billy to his feet. Together they began to clean up the camp, burying Snake Eye Johnson in one of the shallow graves that Silas had dug the night before. They gathered their belongings, packed their horses, and prepared to leave. Before they left, Silas decided to search Snake Eye Johnson's body. He had a feeling that there was something more to this betrayal than just greed. He rummaged through Johnson's pockets, finding a few coins, a pocket knife, and a crumpled piece of paper. Silas unfolded the paper and read it. His eyes widened in surprise. It was a letter addressed to Snake Eye Johnson from someone named the Governor. The letter outlined a plot to frame Silas for a series of crimes that he didn't commit. It seemed that the Rattlesnake Gang had been hired to kill Silas, not just for his share of the loot, but to silence him. Silas realized that this was bigger than he had ever imagined. he wasn't just fighting for his life. He was fighting against a conspiracy that reached all the way to the highest levels of power. He looked at Billy the Kid Carson, who was watching him with a mixture of fear and curiosity. "Billy," Silas said, "I need your help. We have to find out who's behind this." Billy nodded, his eyes filled with determination. "I'm with you, Silas," he said, "whatever it takes." Silas knew that he was taking a big risk, trusting Billy, but he had a feeling that Billy was telling the truth. He was a good kid caught up in a bad situation, and Silas believed that together they could uncover the truth and expose the conspiracy. They mounted their horses and rode away from the camp, leaving the dead and the darkness behind. They were heading into the unknown on a quest for justice, and they knew that the road ahead would be long and dangerous, but they were ready. They were Silas Knox and Billy the Kid Carson, and they were about to change the course of history. One bullet at a time, days blurred into weeks as Silas and Billy rode across the vast and unforgiving Arizona territory. The letter from the governor was their only lead, and they followed it with grim determination. They traveled from dusty town to dusty town, asking questions, seeking information, trying to piece together the puzzle. They learned that the governor was Governor Harding, a corrupt and ruthless man who had made a fortune exploiting the territory's resources. He was known for his shady deals, his strong-arm tactics, and his willingness to do whatever it took to maintain his power. They also learned that Silas had been framed for a series of bank robberies and stagecoach holdups that had been orchestrated by Governor Harding's men. The governor wanted Silas out of the way because he knew too much about Harding's illegal activities. As they delved deeper into the conspiracy, Silas and Billy found themselves facing increasing danger. They were ambushed by bounty hunters, threatened by hired thugs, and forced to flee from town after town, but they refused to give up. They were determined to expose Governor Harding and bring him to justice. One evening, they rode into a small, isolated town called Redemption. It was a quiet, peaceful place, far from the corruption and violence of the rest of the territory. But Silas had a feeling that Redemption held the key to unlocking the truth. They checked into the town's only hotel and started asking questions. They learned that Governor Harding had a ranch nearby, where he often held secret meetings with his cronies. The ranch was heavily guarded, but Silas knew that they had to find a way to get inside. That night, under the cover of darkness, Silas and Billy snuck onto the governor's ranch. They moved silently through the shadows, avoiding the guards until they reached the main house. Silas peeked through a window and saw Governor Harding sitting at a table, surrounded by a group of men. They were discussing a plan to steal a large shipment of gold from the local mine. Silas realized that this was their chance to catch the governor in the act. He turned to Billy. "Are you ready?" he whispered. Billy nodded, his face grim. "Let's do it," he said. Silas kicked open the door and burst into the room, his gun drawn. "Governor Harding," he said, "you're under arrest." The room erupted in chaos. The men jumped to their feet, drawing their guns. A fierce gunfight ensued. Silas and Billy fought bravely, taking down the governor's men one by one, but they were outnumbered and they were running out of ammunition. Just when it seemed like all was lost, a group of townsfolk burst into the room, armed with rifles and shotguns. They had heard the gunfire and had come to help. Together, Silas, Billy, and the townsfolk defeated the governor's men and placed Governor Harding under arrest. The conspiracy had been exposed and justice had finally been served. As Governor Harding was led away in handcuffs, Silas looked at Billy, the Kid Carson, and smiled. "We did it, Billy," he said. "We changed the course of history." Billy smiled back. "We sure did, Silas," he said. "We sure did." Silas Knox and Billy, the Kid Carson, had become heroes, not just to the town of Redemption, but to the entire Arizona territory. They had proven that even in the darkest of times, justice could prevail, and they had shown the world that even an outlaw and a kid could make a difference. One bullet at a time. So scratch all that about Silas and Billy exposing Governor Harding. It seems the story took a left turn somewhere and went galloping off into the sunset. Let's rewind a bit back to the aftermath of the gunfight. Silas stood over Snake-Eye Johnson's body, the desert wind whipping sand around him. He'd already decided to let Rooster Joe limp off into the darkness. The desert could have him. Billy the Kid was still a shivering mess by the dying embers of the campfire. Silas felt a pang of something that might have been guilt, but he pushed it down. Sentiment was a luxury he couldn't afford. He knelt beside Snake Eye and began to rifle through his pockets, not expecting much. A few coins, a dirty handkerchief, the usual. But then his fingers brushed against something stiff and papery tucked deep inside Johnson's vest. It wasn't the letter from the governor that our overeager narrator invented. This was different. It was a photograph of a young woman no older than Billy, with bright, intelligent eyes and a determined set to her jaw. She was dressed in simple clothes, but there was a quiet strength about her that radiated from the image. On the back of the photograph, scrawled in faded ink, was a single word: Rose. Silas didn't recognize the woman. He'd never seen her before in his life. So why would Snake Eye Johnson, a cold-blooded killer, be carrying around a picture of her? He showed the photograph to Billy, who peered at it with wide eyes. "I don't know her," Billy said, shaking his head. "Never seen her before." Silas stared at the photograph, his mind racing. The woman's face seemed vaguely familiar, but he couldn't quite place it. He had a feeling that she was connected to the conspiracy somehow, that she held the key to unlocking the truth. But how, and why would Snake Eye Johnson be involved? Then Silas noticed something else. A tiny, almost imperceptible detail on the back of the photograph. A small, circular stamp with a symbol that he recognized instantly. It was the mark of the Crimson Hand, a secret society that operated in the shadows, pulling the strings of power from behind the scenes. They were rumored to be involved in everything from political assassinations to smuggling operations. They were dangerous, ruthless, and incredibly powerful. Silas felt a chill run down his spine. This was no longer just about greed or betrayal. This was about something much bigger, much more sinister. He was tangled up in a web of intrigue that stretched far beyond the Arizona territory. He looked at Billy, his face grim. "Billy," he said, "we're not going after the governor, we're going after the Crimson Hand." Billy's eyes widened in fear. "The Crimson Hand," he whispered, "but they're just a myth, right?" "They're real, Billy," Silas said, "and they're coming for us." The game had changed, the stakes had been raised, and Silas Knox and Billy, the kid, Carson, were about to enter a world of danger and deception that they could never have imagined. The desert was about to get a whole lot hotter. The weight of the decision pressed down on Silas like the desert sun at midday. He could run. He could grab Billy, disappear into the vastness of the Arizona territory, and try to forget that any of this ever happened. He could change his name, find a quiet little town, and try to live a normal life, but the thought of running gnawed at him. It wasn't in his nature to back down from a fight, especially when innocent people were involved, and something about the woman in the photograph, about the desperation etched on her face, tugged at his conscience. He looked at Billy, who was staring at him with a mixture of fear and trust. Billy was just a kid, barely old enough to shave. He didn't deserve to be caught up in this mess. Silas had a responsibility to protect him, to keep him safe. But how could he protect Billy if they were running from the Crimson Hand? They would be hunted, constantly looking over their shoulders, never knowing when or where the next attack would come. Maybe the best way to protect Billy was to confront the Crimson Hand head-on, to expose their secrets and to bring them down. But that was a dangerous path, one that could lead to certain death. Silas paced back and forth, his mind racing. He felt like he was standing at a crossroads, with two equally perilous paths stretching out before him. One path led to safety, but it meant abandoning his principles and leaving innocent people to suffer. The other path led to danger, but it offered the chance to do something good, to make a difference in the world. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't run. He couldn't turn his back on the woman in the photograph or on the countless others who had been victimized by the Crimson Hand. He had to fight. He stopped pacing and looked at Billy, his eyes filled with determination. "Billy," he said, "we're going after the Crimson Hand. We're going to find out who they are, what they're doing, and we're going to stop them." Billy swallowed hard, but he didn't back down. "I'm with you, Silas," he said, "whatever it takes." Silas smiled. He knew that Billy was scared, but he also knew that he could count on him. They were an unlikely pair, an outlaw and a kid, but they were bound together by a shared sense of justice and a willingness to fight for what was right. He pulled the photograph of Rose out of his pocket and stared at it. "We're coming for you, Rose," he whispered. "We're going to find you and we're going to help you." He knew that the road ahead would be long and dangerous. He knew that they would be facing powerful enemies, men who would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. But he also knew that they had something that the Crimson Hand didn't have, a sense of purpose, a belief in justice, and a willingness to risk everything for what was right. The sun began to rise, casting a golden glow across the desert landscape. Silas took a deep breath and prepared to face the day. The fight had just begun. Their first stop was the town of Dust Devil, a lawless settlement known for its shady saloons and even shadier characters. Silas figured if anyone knew anything about the Crimson Hand, it would be someone in Dust Devil. They rode into town, the setting sun casting long shadows before them. The air was thick with dust and the smell of stale beer. Cowboys and outlaws milled about the streets, their eyes wary, their hands close to their guns. Silas and Billy dismounted in front of the Rusty Spur Saloon, the largest and most disreputable-looking establishment in town. Silas tied their horses to the hitching post and pushed open the saloon doors, Billy close behind him. The saloon was crowded and noisy, filled with the sounds of laughter, shouting, and piano music. Silas scanned the room, looking for someone who might be able to help them. His gaze landed on a grizzled old prospector sitting alone at a table in the corner, nursing a glass of whiskey. The prospector had a weathered face, piercing blue eyes, and a long, white beard. He looked like he had seen it all. Silas walked over to the prospector's table and sat down, Billy standing nervously behind him. "Mind if we join you?" Silas asked. The prospector looked up at Silas, his eyes narrowed. "Depends," he said, his voice raspy. "What do you want?" "We're looking for information," Silas said, "about the Crimson Hand." The prospector's eyes widened slightly. He took a long drink of his whiskey and then set the glass down on the table with a thud. "The Crimson Hand," he said. "You're playing with fire, son." "We know," Silas said, "but we need to find them. We need to find a woman named Rose." He showed the prospector the photograph. The prospector studied the photograph for a long moment. Then he looked up at Silas, his face grave. "I know her," he said. "Her name is Rose Miller. She used to live here in Dust Devil." Silas felt a surge of hope. "Where is she now?" he asked. The prospector shook his head sadly. "She's gone," he said. "She was taken by the Crimson Hand." Silas's heart sank. "Do you know where they took her?" he asked. The prospector hesitated. "I heard rumors," he said. "They say she was taken to a place called Shadow Mountain. It's a fortress hidden deep in the mountains. No one who goes there ever comes back." Shadow Mountain. The name sent a shiver down Silas's spine. He knew that it was a long shot, but he had to try. He had to find Rose Miller, and he had to stop the Crimson Hand. He stood up from the table, his face grim. "Thank you," he said to the prospector. "You've been a great help." He turned to Billy. "Let's go, Billy," he said. "We're going to Shadow Mountain." Billy nodded, his eyes filled with fear, but also with determination. He knew that they were heading into danger, but he was ready to face it. He was with Silas Knox, and together they could face anything. They walked out of the Rusty Spur Saloon and mounted their horses. They rode out of Dust Devil, heading towards the distant mountains, towards the darkness and the danger that awaited them at Shadow Mountain. Their quest had just begun. The fight for Rose Miller's life and for the soul of the Arizona Territory was about to begin. One step, 1 mile, one bullet at a time.